It started like any other night. A young law student packed her notes, left the library, and walked the same path she'd taken hundreds of times before. The next morning, her apartment door was scorched, her laptop still glowing on the desk, and she was gone. Inside, police found her wallet, her keys, and a single window open to the cold February air. Footprints in soot led towards the parking lot and vanished halfway across the pavement. Athens, Georgia. 2002. A small college town turned into a city holding its breath. For 21 years, no one knew what really happened to Rachel McAdams, until a single strand of hair, sealed inside an old evidence bag, finally spoke. Tell us, where are you watching from tonight? Subscribe, follow, and turn on the notification bell, because in every cold case somewhere, the truth is still waiting to surface. Rachel McAdams was 24, a first-year law student at the University of Georgia. She lived alone in apartment 2A on River Mill Road, a small place, just a desk, a bookshelf, and a single lamp that stayed on long after midnight. Her life was built on routine. Every morning she left for class with a thermos of coffee and a stack of color-coded notes. Every night she walked home from the library, same route, same hour. She wasn't careless, just predictable. The kind of predictability that makes people feel safe. Until it doesn't. Friends described her as steady. She planned every week in advance, labeled every folder, returned every call. She was trying to build a life of order in a world that rarely offered it. At the cafe near her apartment, she always sat at the far corner table with a view of the door. She wasn't unfriendly, just quiet. She smiled at familiar faces, asked for her coffee the same way each time. No sugar, extra milk. When she studied, nothing could reach her. The people who knew her best said she was preparing for something bigger. Clerkship. Maybe the DA's office one day. She talked about justice like it was a promise she meant to keep. Nothing about Rachel's life suggested danger. No strange visitors, no complaints, just a young woman following the straight path she believed would lead somewhere good. But every life has its blind corners. That winter, she mentioned to a friend that someone had been standing near her car a few nights in a row. A shadow she couldn't quite place. She brushed it off. Probably another tenant. She didn't believe in bad endings. The night before she disappeared, she sent an email to her professor about an ethics assignment. Her last sentence read, "See you tomorrow morning." She never showed up. Later, her neighbor said the light in apartment 2A, the one that burned past midnight every night, went dark earlier than usual. At first, no one thought much of it. In a college town, people come and go all the time, but for those who knew Rachel, that light meant something. It was the sign she was home, safe, doing what she always did, working, planning, living. The night it went out for good, no one in Athens noticed. Not yet. It would take only a few hours for silence to become a question. And that question would never fully go away. Friday, February 15th, 2002. It started as another ordinary night in Rachel McAdams's carefully built routine. At 7:45 p.m., cameras at the University of Georgia Law Library caught her leaving. Laptop bag over her shoulder, hair pulled back, coat zipped to the collar. She walked out alone, paused by the steps as if deciding something, then turned left, toward home. It was a walk she had made hundreds of times before. Around 9:40 p.m., her friend Lindsay Harper's phone rang. Rachel's voice was steady, but quieter than usual. She said someone was standing in the parking lot near her building. "They keep looking up," she whispered. "I think they're watching my window." The line crackled. Lindsay asked if she wanted to call the police. Rachel said no. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired. That was the last time anyone heard her voice. The next morning, at 8:12 a.m., firefighters responded to a report of smoke at River Mill Apartments. The call came from a neighbor who smelled something burning behind Rachel's door. The fire was small, a patch of scorched wood near the entryway, but the scene was wrong in every way. Rachel was gone. Her wallet sat on the counter. Her coat hung by the door. Her phone and keys were on the table beside an open laptop, a screen still glowing. The cursor blinked on a half-finished note. A single window was half open, its frame dusted with ash. The fire had started near the door, as if someone wanted to erase something, not to destroy, but to cover. Investigators noticed footprints in soot leading toward the parking lot. They stopped halfway across the pavement, fading into nothing. By noon, the building was sealed off with yellow tape. Detectives searched the apartment, careful, silent, aware that every object now carried a question. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no blood, only stillness, the kind that feels rehearsed. Neighbors said they hadn't heard anything unusual. One remembered a noise, a soft thud, sometime after 10. Another recalled a car idling for a few minutes before driving away. No one saw a face. The smell of burned paper lingered in the hallway for days. Inside, Rachel's textbooks were stacked neatly on her desk, a pen resting where she had left it. Her life looked paused, not ended. That afternoon, her parents drove in from Savannah. Her mother stood outside the apartment for nearly an hour before she spoke. She said it didn't feel real, like Rachel had just stepped out for coffee and would walk back any minute. But the light in apartment 2A never came on again. Police combed through the surrounding woods and trails by the Oconee River. Search dogs followed her scent from the stairwell to the parking lot, then nowhere. No camera caught her leaving. No witness saw her beyond that final phone call. By evening, the missing person report went public. Athens wasn't used to stories like this. Students posted flyers, volunteers searched under bridges, reporters filled the airwaves with her photo. But days passed, and the story stayed the same. Rachel McAdams had vanished between one heartbeat and the next. There were no leads, no ransom, no reason, only a burned doorway, a silent apartment, and a routine that had suddenly stopped. Sometimes in missing person cases, there's a moment, a single breath, when people close to the victim realize the world has already changed. For Rachel's family, that moment came when the police handed back her laptop. The screen had gone dark. The cursor had stopped blinking. And for the first time, silence filled the space where her life used to be. Within hours, Athens changed. By noon the next day, patrol cars lined River Mill Road. Volunteers gathered outside the apartment complex, clutching photocopied flyers that showed Rachel's graduation photo, her smile too bright for the word missing. Detectives from the Athens Clark County Police Department began the search with precision. Trace evidence, witness lists, perimeter sweeps. They collected the burned fragments from her doorway and sealed them in paper bags marked Exhibit 12. Every movement inside the apartment was photographed, every item catalogued. Still, the room told them nothing. By evening, the search expanded. Officers and students walked the wooded paths behind the complex, calling her name into the still air. K-9 units tracked her scent down the back stairwell, through the gravel lot, and into the thin line of trees that bordered the Oconee River. Then, the trail simply stopped. No scent, no sign, just the quiet pulse of water moving downstream. Reporters arrived 2 days later. They set up near the River Mill Cafe, where Rachel used to study at night. Microphones pointed toward officers who had nothing new to say. "We're pursuing all leads," one detective repeated, his face expressionless, his eyes rimmed red from no sleep. Lindsay Harper, The friend who received the last phone call was interviewed that afternoon. She kept her voice steady, but her hands shook when she described the moment Rachel said, "He's looking at my window." She didn't know who he was. She still doesn't. Police questioned students, professors, maintenance workers. They searched dumpsters, drains, and every storage shed within a mile of River Mill. Nothing. The fire report came back inconclusive. Too small to destroy much. Too specific to be random. Accelerant residue was detected, but not enough to name. Rachel's parents rented a motel room 2 blocks from the station. Every morning, they stood outside the taped-off building as if waiting for someone to open the door and explain. Her mother carried one of Rachel's textbooks, Criminal Law and Procedure, and refused to let it out of her hands. Weeks passed. Flyers began to curl at the edges, the ink running from the rain. Students stopped talking about it out loud, but the silence carried her name in every hallway. The police line on River Mill faded from yellow to pale white. Athens, a town built on youth and movement, grew still. The River Mill Cafe cut its hours. People crossed the street instead of walking past Rachel's building. Every night, the streetlights flickered against the dark windows of apartment 2A, a space no one wanted to look at for long. Detectives stayed on the case, but momentum bled away. They had a timeline, a scene, a voice on a phone. They didn't have Rachel. By March, the search teams were called back. Officially, the case shifted from missing person to possible criminal disappearance. Unofficially, everyone knew what that meant. One detective, a veteran of 20 years, later said the silence around the case felt different. Usually, you get something, a lead, a tip, a mistake. This one just stopped breathing. That phrase stayed with people, because that's what Athens became, a city holding its breath. The phone in Rachel's apartment had stopped ringing, her email filled with unanswered messages. Her parents stopped unpacking their suitcases. Somewhere in the distance, the Oconee River moved on, carrying away whatever it had seen that night. And in a quiet town built on order and routine, a single missing woman became the line where certainty ended, and everything else began. 21 years passed. The case file of Rachel McAdams sat deep in the archives of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, a thick folder labeled Cold Case Number 1147. Dust covered the edges. Inside, photographs had begun to fade, their corners curled with time. In June 2023, forensic analyst Maya Chen opened that file for the first time. She was 32, methodical, quiet, the kind of investigator who believed that even silence leaves evidence if you listen long enough. The McAdams file wasn't assigned to her. She found it during a departmental audit, a forgotten box of unsolved disappearances. Something about Rachel's case stopped her. The clean apartment, the controlled fire, the footprints that ended halfway to the parking lot. It all felt deliberate. Among the old evidence bags was one marked Apt 2A Door Lock, Hair Fragment. It had been sealed since 2002. Back then, the technology couldn't extract a full DNA profile. But 21 years had changed what science could do. Maya cut open the bag and prepared the sample under sterile light. The hair was almost invisible, a single thread caught in the metal grooves of the lock. She ran it through the state database first. No match. Then through the national system. Still nothing. Finally, she tried the genetic genealogy program recently approved for cold cases. The computer processed for hours, silent except for the low hum of the lab's ventilation. Then the result appeared, a partial family link. The name, Eric Faust, a distant relative from South Carolina. Maya read through the attached record. a maintenance technician at Rivermill Apartments in 2002. He had keys to every unit. His employment ended 2 weeks after the disappearance. There was no forwarding address. She leaned back in her chair. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she wrote a single note at the bottom of the page. Reopen. Contact Athens PD. That afternoon, the report landed on Detective James Ford's desk. He had been a rookie officer in Athens when Rachel vanished. Now, his hair was gray, his voice rough from years of interviews and unsolved endings. When he saw the name, something in him tightened. He remembered Faust, a quiet man who'd said he barely knew Rachel, who helped police check fire alarms after the incident, then disappeared. Detective Ford reopened the McAdams file that same day. For the first time in 2 decades, the case number was active again. The team began cross-referencing employment records, utility bills, and DMV databases. Within days, they traced Faust's old truck, 98 Ford Ranger, to a scrapyard outside Columbia, South Carolina. The vehicle had been impounded in 2003 for unpaid tickets. Inside one of the archived parking citations was a timestamp, 9:52 p.m., February 15, 2002. Issued near Rivermill Apartments, the exact night Rachel called her friend. The discovery wasn't dramatic. No breaking news, no flashing lights, just quiet confirmation. A small proof that the story still had a pulse. When Maya Chen filed her report, she added a note to the internal log. Evidence suggests original investigation missed key suspect. Recommend active pursuit. That evening, she drove home in silence. She'd seen hundreds of cold cases, most of them dead ends, but something about this one felt unfinished, not just by evidence, but by human intent. 21 years after Rachel's light went out, a name had surfaced again. Not an answer, but a direction. And sometimes, in the long life of a cold case, that's all you need, a single name that dares the silence to speak. When Detective James Ford reopened the McAdams case, he didn't start with theory. He started with the evidence, what still existed after 2 decades of silence. Old reports, interviews, surveillance tapes degraded by time. Every document was scanned, relabeled, and mapped across a single wall in the GBI cold case unit. At the center was Rachel's photograph, her law student ID, pinned beside a photocopy of Eric Faust's employee record. 2 lives that once crossed only through a key and a lock. Faust's name had barely surfaced in the original 2002 interviews. He'd claimed he didn't know Rachel personally, only fixed the hallway smoke detectors. But in the maintenance logs, Ford found something strange. An electronic keycard entry recorded at 9:47 p.m., February 15, 2002. The location, 2nd floor, Building A. Rachel's floor. That small digital line changed everything. The original investigators had assumed the card system malfunctioned during the fire. The heat had corrupted timestamps. But forensic technicians reanalyzed the data using preserved backups from the property's security vendor. The entry was real, and Faust had been there. Detectives began retracing his history. He'd worked odd maintenance jobs across Georgia and South Carolina, never staying long. A minor assault charge in '99. A probation violation. Then nothing. He disappeared from public record around 2003, same year his truck was found abandoned. Ford ordered a forensic review of the fire scene photos. Modern imaging tools revealed details the old cameras had missed. Burn patterns forming a near-perfect ring around the doorframe. Accelerant residue. Someone had set that fire. Not to burn the apartment down, but to eliminate fingerprints. A retired fire investigator confirmed it. This wasn't random ignition, he said quietly. This was cleanup. As the team pieced together the timeline, another pattern emerged. Faust's work log showed multiple visits to Building A during the week before the disappearance, more than his usual maintenance calls. He'd checked smoke detectors, plumbing, even door hinges. Each visit signed under his initials. E.F. Ford pinned those sheets beside Rachel's daily routine, library hours, cafe receipts, phone records. The overlap was unsettling. The detectives didn't say it out loud, but they all felt it. The rhythm of preparation. When they enhanced an old crime scene photo of Rachel's front door, a faint shoe print appeared near the lower frame. Size 11, industrial sole. The same make issued to maintenance staff in 2002. Piece by piece, the story began to breathe again. But the case wasn't about proof yet. It was about patience, letting fragments align until they spoke for themselves. Ford kept the board up for weeks, sometimes sitting alone in the office long after midnight, staring at the photos as if they might finally explain why a promising young woman vanished and why a quiet man disappeared right after her. The silence that had once smothered the McAdams case now carried weight. Every unanswered call, every missing record, they all seemed deliberate. In July 2023, Ford signed the order to locate Eric Faust. The line on the form read simply, "Person of interest, believed alive." It was the first official movement in 21 years, and somewhere between the old paper trails and the hum of fluorescent lights, the case that once stopped breathing began to exhale again. When detectives looked deeper into the old reports, they realized Eric Faust wasn't the only shadow in Rachel's orbit. There were others, names buried in the footnotes of interviews, details overlooked because they didn't fit the story anyone wanted to tell in 2002. One was Professor Alan Whitmore, who taught ethics and criminal law. In the original notes, Rachel had filed a quiet complaint about him. Not formal, just a line in a student advisor's log, "Uncomfortable after office meeting." The entry was never followed up. Whitmore still worked at the university until 2010, then quietly retired. Another was David Holt, a fellow law student. He'd argued with Rachel in front of classmates a week before she disappeared. Witnesses said it was over a case debate, a heated one about moral responsibility and criminal defense. He had shouted. She'd walked out. He later told police it was nothing personal. For 2 decades, these fragments stayed separate, dismissed as coincidence. But in the reopened investigation, coincidence wasn't enough anymore. Detective Ford ordered re-interviews. Whitmore, now 70, lived alone in Augusta. When questioned, he said he remembered Rachel as bright, ambitious, maybe too idealistic. He denied any inappropriate behavior, yet his tone, soft, distant, carried something that unsettled the younger officers. When they left, one of them wrote in the log, "He's not lying, but he's hiding something." David Holt, on the other hand, had left law entirely. He was now a contractor in North Carolina, married, 2 kids. When detectives met him, he seemed genuinely startled that Rachel's case had reopened. He said he'd thought about her for years, that she didn't deserve what happened. Then he paused and added quietly, "You think it was that maintenance guy, don't you?" They didn't answer. Ford kept coming back to one fact. Only Faust had access to the master key system. But the idea of him acting alone didn't quite fit. The fire, the missing traces, the precision, it felt orchestrated, almost rehearsed. Investigators combed through faculty logs from 2002. Whitmore's car had been parked at the university until nearly 10 p.m. that night, but his phone records showed a call from a Rivermill landline around 9:46 p.m. The line belonged to the apartment complex office. No one could prove who dialed it. Ford stared at that timestamp for a long time. 9:46. Rachel's last phone call was at 9:43. Faust's keycard entry, 9:47. 3 events, almost touching. Still, there was no hard evidence linking anyone else to the disappearance. No fingerprints, no eyewitness, no confession. Only a sequence that felt too close to ignore. By fall of 2023, the team traced Faust's trail to Columbia, South Carolina. He'd lived under at least 2 aliases, moving between short-term jobs, never filing taxes, never renewing an ID. He was alive. The decision was made to approach carefully. A warrant would take time. Surveillance came first. In briefing, Ford told his team, "We're not chasing ghosts. We're listening to the story the silence has been telling us all along." When they pulled the first image from a street camera, an older man with gray hair, a limp loading tools into a pickup, the room went quiet. For 21 years, Athens had been haunted by an empty space where Rachel used to be. Now that space had a face again, but the deeper they looked, the less certain they became. Because if Faust was truly running from guilt, he'd been running a long time, and maybe not just from what he'd done, but from who told him to do it. And in cold cases, that difference can change everything. April 2024. After months of surveillance, the search for Eric Faust reached its turning point. Detectives in Columbia, South Carolina, had been watching him for weeks. A man in his late 40s, older now, heavier, slower. He lived alone in a small rented house on the edge of town, the kind of place with overgrown grass and a single porch light that never worked. He kept to himself. No visitors, no noise. Every movement measured. When the warrant finally came through, they entered before dawn. The house smelled of oil and dust. Tools lined the walls of the garage, arranged by size. Orderly, precise, too precise. In a small metal box on the workbench, they found what stopped the room: a silver ring. Inside the band, the initials were engraved RM. It was cleaned, polished, almost reverent. Faust didn't resist arrest. He just asked one question. "Did you find the map?" At that moment, no one knew what he meant. In the basement, they found it. A water-stained topographic map of the Oconee River system. A red circle marked Mile 7. Beside it, in small, jagged handwriting, "She's gone." The handwriting matched samples from Faust's employment forms. Detectives called Ford in Athens. When he heard the words Mile 7, he didn't speak for several seconds. That stretch of river had been part of the original search zone, but it was flooded at the time. No dig had ever been done there. The DNA report arrived the same week. The hair fragment from Rachel's door lock, the one Maya Chen had tested, was a direct match to Faust. For the first time in 22 years, there was something that could be called proof. Still, the mood in the investigation room wasn't triumph. It was quiet. Cold cases don't bring closure, only clarity, and sometimes even that feels cruel. Ford requested a search warrant for the Mile 7 site. In his report, he wrote only, "Possibility of remains or personal effects. Proceed with controlled excavation." Before they transported Faust, Ford sat with him in an interview room. The tape ran, but most of what passed between them didn't need sound. Ford asked if Rachel was at the river. Faust looked down, eyes blank. "I didn't kill her," he said softly. "I just cleaned up what someone told me to clean." Ford didn't press. Sometimes truth hides best in silence. Later, when investigators processed Faust's house, they cataloged every item. Old maintenance uniforms, a stack of newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances, a burned photograph too damaged to identify. To outsiders, it looked like a confession. But to those who'd worked cold cases long enough, it looked like something else. A man haunted by what he'd done and what he'd been told to forget. The evidence was sent back to Athens. The media caught the story days later. Suspect found in 2002 missing student case. For the first time in decades, Rachel McAdams' name returned to the headlines. In the GBI lab, Maya Chen stood by the evidence table, the ring sealed in its plastic bag. It gleamed under the fluorescent light, catching its own reflection in the clear surface. She whispered, barely audible, "We found you." But even then, everyone knew finding a ring wasn't the same as finding a body. The truth had surfaced, but not all of it. Not yet. Next came the dig. The place marked in red on the map, Mile 7, waited beneath 22 years of river mud and silence. And when the ground would finally open, Athens would have to listen again. June 12, 2024. The excavation at Mile 7 began just after sunrise. Fog clung to the surface of the Oconee River, the same river that had carried away every trace of Rachel McAdams 22 years earlier. Detectives, forensic teams, and volunteers gathered in silence. No cameras were allowed at first, only the low hum of generators, the sound of boots sinking into wet soil. Detective Ford stood a few feet from the waterline, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. It wasn't the first dig he'd led, but something about this one felt heavier. Every shovel of earth was 22 years of waiting. The GBI forensic unit marked off a 30-foot perimeter based on the red circle from Faust's map. Ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the surface. Dense layers of silt, debris, and clay. Then, just before noon, a faint shape appeared on the monitor. A rectangular object, 3 feet down. When they unearthed it, the river gave up something it had been holding. A charred leather bag, sealed by mud and time. Inside were fragments of paper, the outline of a student ID card, and a journal with burned edges, the letters RM faintly embossed on the cover. The air around the team changed. No one spoke. They lifted each piece carefully, separating what could still be read. One page, half burned but legible, contained a final entry in blue ink. If anything happens, check the faculty. The handwriting matched samples from Rachel's notes found in her apartment. Ford read the line twice, then closed the folder. He didn't say a word. There were no bones, no human remains, no physical proof of death, but for the first time the case felt like it had a voice. Faint, but real. When news of the discovery broke, Athens froze again. Reporters filled River Mill Road. Students who hadn't even been born in 2002 watched the coverage like a ghost story that had finally found its ending. Yet for Rachel's family, it wasn't an ending at all, just another kind of silence. Her mother told a local station, "She was trying to tell us something, she always was." In the evidence room that night, the journal lay open under glass. The ink had bled from years underground, but the last words still held, "Check the faculty." The phrase reopened every theory. The professor she'd reported, the argument in class, the phone call from the apartment office line at 9:46 p.m. The pattern was still there, only clearer now. Faust's map had brought them to Mile 7, but it hadn't answered who he was cleaning up for. The next morning, Ford met with Maya Chen. They stood beside the riverbank looking at the freshly turned earth. She asked if he believed Rachel had been killed here. Ford shook his head slowly. "I think someone wanted us to think she was." Forensic analysis confirmed traces of accelerant on the bag, the same type found on Rachel's apartment door. It meant one thing. Whoever set the fire had also burned this. Maybe to hide evidence. maybe to mark an ending that wasn't real. In the official report, Ford wrote, "Recovered personal effects belonging to Rachel McAdams. No remains. Evidence suggests concealment rather than disposal." The dig ended at dusk. The river settled again, dark and calm, as if nothing had been disturbed. But in Athens, people began to whisper. Maybe Rachel hadn't died at all. Maybe she escaped. Or maybe some wanted her story buried deep enough that the truth would never float back up. Either way, Mile 7 had spoken. And once the river gives something back, it never truly goes silent again. January 2025. Athens, Georgia. 23 years after Rachel McAdams vanished. The courtroom was small, its walls lined with cameras and quiet faces. The trial of Eric Faust began on a gray morning, the air heavy with something that felt more like exhaustion than anticipation. Faust sat at the defense table, pale and expressionless. His hands trembled when he touched the microphone. He'd been charged with kidnapping and arson, but not murder. There was still no body, no confirmation of death. Just a story stitched together from evidence, memory, and silence. The prosecution called it a crime of control, a man with keys to every door, obsessed with a tenant who never noticed him. They showed the jury the silver ring, the journal from the riverbank. The map marked Mile 7. They played the 9:43 p.m. voicemail from Rachel's friend Lindsay, the one that ended mid-breath. The defense called it coincidence, a tragic misunderstanding built on bad luck and broken records. They said Faust was just a maintenance worker caught in a storm that wasn't his. For weeks, witnesses filled the stand. Former students, neighbors, old officers. Detective Ford testified on the third day. He spoke plainly, no dramatics. He told the court about the DNA match, the fire residue, the missing trail. When asked if he believed Faust killed Rachel, he hesitated. "I believe he knows what happened," he said. "And I believe he's not the only one." That sentence changed everything. When Faust finally took the stand, the room went silent. He spoke only once. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I just cleaned up what someone told me to clean." No one moved. The words hung there, heavy and incomplete. The prosecutor asked who told him. Faust stared at the floor. "I can't," he said softly. "They're still out there." The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing. But Ford, sitting in the back, didn't look surprised. He'd suspected this all along, that Faust was the hand, not the mind. During cross-examination, the defense introduced a final piece of evidence. A fingerprint lifted from the leather bag found at Mile 7. It wasn't Rachel's, it wasn't Faust's. It belonged to an unidentified third person, someone who had never appeared in the investigation files. The revelation fractured the case. The prosecution requested time to verify. The judge agreed. Sentencing was postponed indefinitely. Outside the courthouse, Rachel's mother spoke to the press. "We don't need justice," she said quietly. "We just need answers." Reporters replayed that clip for weeks, her voice trembling but certain. Inside the evidence room, the ring, the journal, the burned bag. They all sat sealed in plastic, labeled, preserved, waiting. But they no longer told a clear story. Some in Athens believed Faust was guilty in protecting someone powerful. Others believed he was manipulated, a pawn used and discarded. The truth, whatever it was, remained unsteady, like the reflection of light on river water, shifting each time you tried to look straight at it. 23 years. No body, no confession, just a ring, a map, and a question that refused to die. Detective Ford retired that spring. Before leaving his desk for the last time, he wrote one line in the margin of the case file. Maybe the story isn't about what happened to Rachel. Maybe it's about everyone who let her disappear. The file was closed again. Not solved, not forgotten. And outside, as dusk settled over Athens, the streetlights flickered on along River Mill Road, just like they did the night she vanished. Only this time, no window glowed in apartment 2A. Just darkness, waiting for a truth that might never surface. This story was inspired by a real case, a young law student who vanished after a small fire in her apartment in Athens, Georgia, in the early 2000s. Her disappearance haunted a town, an investigation, and everyone who ever touched the file. More than 2 decades later, science gave her a name again. But even with DNA, evidence, and trials, no one could fill the space she left behind. The case remains unsolved. The file, now labeled closed, unresolved, sits on a shelf in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's archives. Inside, the same photograph of Rachel McAdams, smiling, hopeful, still looks out from the first page. The corners are worn, but the eyes haven't aged. Detective Ford retired quietly. He never spoke to reporters again. Analyst Maya Chen stayed on the job, working other cold cases. She once said in an interview, "We don't really solve them. We just try to listen long enough for the truth to speak." And somewhere, along the Oconee River, the ground still remembers. Every town has its silence, the kind that comes after something terrible, the kind people learn to live around. In Athens, that silence still belongs to Rachel. This story isn't about heroes or villains. It's about the distance between what we know and what we can prove. It's about how time erases evidence, but never the ache of not knowing. Tonight, as you listen, remember that Rachel was real. She had plans, routines, people who loved her. She left behind more questions than answers, and maybe that's the truest part of every cold case, because behind every missing person's file, there's a mother who still waits by the phone. Behind every unsolved story, there's a detective who keeps one photo on his desk years after retirement. And behind every silence, there's a voice that once said, "See you tomorrow." If you've made it this far, keep remembering them. Keep asking questions, because truth has a way of surfacing, even after decades of quiet. And sometimes, that's all the justice we have left.